Welcome to Stack Dice, where I talk about all my favorite nerd stuff. Since quite some time, I've been heavily invested in board games, but I never really got the chance to get into D&D before. So I would like to take you with me on the journey I took to my very first game. At the time of recording this video, I have already played my very first session as Dungeon Master with a group of players who had also no experience in playing Dungeons & Dragons, except one who played a different role-playing game before. So first I would like to talk about the preparations I took for the game, like how I learned about the rules, the basic story I wanted to follow for the first game, what changes I did make during that process. Then I will talk a bit about the characters my players created. After that, we'll go a bit through the presentation of how I thought the adventure should be experienced best, which props I used, which miniatures, and all that. Then I will talk about how the game actually went through, like what was my plan, what I expected, and how the players actually behaved during the game. And finally, we'll give a small conclusion. So for the basic game rules, originally when I wanted to start D&D for the very first time, I just got the starter kit. But then Corona hit, so I never really got the chance to fully play it, or at least try it out the way it's supposed to be, because you guess you could play it with 2 players, but it didn't really seem right. So waited a bit, and during that time I still got very excited to try it. So first, when I got the starter kit, I wanted to play the Lost Mines of Phandelver adventure, but during the time I already knew that my players would be much more interested in creating their own characters than just having the basic characters. When I read through the player handbook, I already expected that we will make lots and lots of rule mistakes. So whenever you notice, feel free to just comment them. And I also checked what types of miniatures I could use for the Lost Mines of Phandelver. And I realized I didn't really have that many miniatures I could already use for that. So I did some researching, digging around, and I figured that I already had quite a lot of stuff for Curse of Strahd, which later turns out was a huge mistake, because I also needed lots of stuff for Curse of Strahd. Then I realized the Death House has a reputation of not being the best first adventure, so I was a bit scared of running it, especially because it is located in the village of Barovia. So my first instinct was to just move it out of Barovia, just into a wilderness. So the players had no choice to go anywhere else but the Death House. So as introduction, I just read a homebrewed version of how they were traveling with the Vistani through the woods of Barovia. They passed the gate, and then the cart got stuck somewhere in the woods close to the Death House. So there was only some trees and the Death House on the encounter map. So they had no choice. For the story, I adjusted the house a bit and exchanged the Shambling Mound for a mutated version of Mother Durst, because I just figured it might be a bit more interesting if the players discover that the mom was the big bad behind all of it. In the dungeon bedroom, they of course would have usually found both parents, but in my version they only found the Father Durst. Originally I was a bit worried that this fight would become too easy then, because they would only find one. But it turns out the session took much longer than I thought originally, so it was fine to just reduce the enemies there. One other fight I changed was the Spectre, because I heard a lot of rumors that this was too tough for a level 1 group. So I just used the stats of a Shadow, but still pretended that that would be the mate. So let's introduce you to our group of heroes. I didn't really give any guidelines to the players about the characters, and we did a session 0 digitally, where we went through the basic rules and how to create the characters. So we do have Escanor, a drow druid, which is a notoric liar who told everyone he's the son of a king, but got banished, and who also prefers the company of plants and animals. We have Rihala, a tiefling warlock who has been abducted as child and worked in a brothel, but not as a prostitute, only did jobber works, and she has a certain fondness of alcohol. We have Akira, a human paladin whose family got killed by raiders and who got adopted by Templars, which showed him the way of faith, religion and honor. And finally we have Sisei, a dragonling rogue who was raised very strictly by a traditional dragonling clan, but kept edging on. So her clan might not like her love of stealing and trickery, but they do respect her. So now let's talk about presentation. When I knew I wanted to get into D&D, I did keep an eye out for miniatures. So I discovered a huge bargain on the Rune Wars game from Fantasy Flight. with lots of expansions. Actually all of the expansions they had at that time. So for the heroes, I thought I already had all the miniatures, but turns out I was very wrong. I needed to get specific miniatures for all of them. For the druid, I wanted to use one of the elves from the commando packs from the Elves of Rune Wars. But the guy playing is also very into board games and a painter, and at work he got a 3D printer, so he just downloaded his own figure and then we turned out using his. For Rihala, I just got the female tiefling sorcerer model. I let the player decide which version she liked more and then she preferred the sorcerer. For Akira, this one was also from the Marvelous miniseries. I had some alternatives from other board games I considered, but none really gave me the paladin vibe. I just would have been any knight. So I just went with this one. So for the Dragonling, it turns out finding a Dragonling rogue is harder than I anticipated, because you can find lots of dragon models or human dragonoids, which are sorcerers, wizards, or warriors, but actually a rogue is very tough to find. So I was just checking randomly on all different types of games there are, and I found the Kings of War game from Mantic, which had a Salamander faction. And I figured that's as close as you get to a Dragonling Rogue, so I just took this one. So let's talk about the NPC miniatures I needed. So first there were Rose and Dawn, and I didn't really have any children miniatures. So I just used this mom and some kids with her. It's not the best, but good enough. For the animated armor, I originally just wanted to use any knight miniature. But since it was going to be the very first fight the players encountered, I figured I needed something a bit more special to set the bar a bit higher. And I found this mini on Etsy, and I guess you can never have too many miniatures. For the Living Broom, it was a bit more difficult, because even though you could find some on Etsy, they came from different countries and it would have been super expensive to have them shipped here. So I just asked the same guy who printed his elf druid miniature himself. I asked him to print one and he got me this one. So it looks really nice. So for the Spectre, I didn't use as Spectre, I just used the Shadow, which I also used the Shadow miniature from Marvelous mini line. So next up are the ghouls. I used them only in the first dungeon part, and I used this miniature from Descent 2nd edition. I don't remember if these were actual ghouls in Descent, but they fit perfectly for what I had in mind. Another Descent 2nd edition miniature I used, I think they were called Brutes in Descent, was this one, and I just used it as Daddy Durst. And finally, for the Shambling Mound, I used this miniature as the Mother. I just thought it was kind of fitting because it still looked like a, I guess, Shambling Mound. It was also a 3D print from Etsy. For the base terrain, I used two different Kraken gaming mats. The first with just some grass as a base, and the second one was a beach, but I only needed it for the water part. For the basic dungeon, I used Warlock tiles, 2 base sets and 1 curved set. However, I only used the curved set in the last bits of the dungeon, as I at least tried to stay true to the shape of a death house. For decoration, since I put the death house outside of Barovia village, I just sprinkled some trees and terrain decoration around it to give the table a more lively look. The roads I used from battle systems. For the death house and the dungeon part, I mostly used stuff from the Mantic terrain crates and occasionally some of the battle systems accessoires. So now let's go to the actual game. I wanted to talk about what I planned and what actually happened in the game then. As mentioned before, I put the death house in the wilderness to really force the player to go into the house while the cart had stopped. So the first thing they did was try to rob the driver who got them there, which I didn't anticipate it. After first fail of a natural one from Escanor, who slipped and had his head hit and a very tiny wound, they finally went to the crying children. They got into the house and focused on the sigil of the windmill, trying to touch it and find a secret behind it, but found nothing. On the ground level, they really surprised me and started to loot everything, even though they at that time didn't know that the kids were ghosts. They just went in and just took everything. I guess it was my fault because when we started, since my group is very familiar with board games, I said to them they should think less of like a board game and more like a video game. And of course, in video games, it's very common that you just go inside every house and grab everything. So that's what they did. On the second floor, they just played around a bit in the piano, including a natural 20 for performance. When they discovered the dead baby and removed the blanket, they had the idea to calm the spectre who attacked them down by just putting the blanket back on the bed. And I really liked this idea because I thought it was very creative, so I just let them do it. So they calmed down the specter, or the shadow in my case, and that was the end of the fight. 4 other fights and the 4th floor went pretty much by the book, except the living room, which they blinded with a blanket and just threw out of the window. After leveling up to level 2, I noticed we took already much longer than I anticipated. I think we were around 4 or 5 hours to get there. I knew that I had to shorten down the dungeon. Luckily, I already built everything beforehand, or at least what I could. So I could just cut pretty much the whole left side of the dungeon and just focus on the right side and did some minor adjustments so it doesn't look like too much of just a path. I only gave them the crypt and an improvised torture room with a statue. The statue wasn't in the torture room, but it was a different room, and the statue leading to the final room. So after they removed the statue, they could just go down there. But before that, I put the fight with the ghouls and with the Father Durst as one fight, which also took longer than I expected, but they managed it. So they did get to the final room. So for the final room, I just cut everything else except for the sacrifice area, which looked like this. In the final room, I still did one must die chanting, and they didn't even discuss to kill each other, or at least one of them. So at some point they just derped around in the room and I just started the fight because they took too long. Mummy Durst attacked them. The fight went pretty well. They used the pillars for transporting themselves over the water areas and some interesting combat ideas. The elf druid casted, I think they're called Flying Light in English, to blind the mother, and then they just kept hitting her from the back. For the mother in the fight, I used the normal shambling mount stats, but I did lower her AC if they attacked from the blinded side. After they beat the mother, we skipped the house becomes a trap part because it was getting really late, so I just let them out of the house and we wrapped it up. As someone who hadn't had any experience playing D&D, no more the Dungeon Master, and only had players who also have no experience, I didn't really know what to expect from the actual game. And one of the first things you find out when you try to research on the internet about it is that you shouldn't overplan things. But people are arguing about what is overplanning, at what point do you plan too much and what's not enough. I feel like my planning was okay. It was definitely useful to have the dungeons pre-built before, or at least the whole setup for all the different floors of the house, so I could know where which room was. And also for the dungeon, when it was time to cut down the size of the dungeon, that I could on the fly decide which rooms were important and which were just nice to have. For the role-playing, I was actually quite surprised how much the players were into it. Expected much more awkwardness, and I guess it was still somewhat awkward, but they all did a great job. Actually, I think the most awkward was my attempt to roleplay with children, so I definitely know that for the next sessions I have to up my NPC game. One other thing I really do wonder is how are you supposed to actually play it with only the theater of mind, if the players have no real knowledge about where stuff is. I'm not really sure I could, or at least I personally would be able to just describe everything with all the details needed for them to discover what they need to discover. I felt it was impossible to not have any visual representation. I might have overdone it some points, but it definitely looked better on the table this way, I think. But overall, it was a really great experience for me and according to the players, also for them. I did learn that the group was much more invested in the story aspect and less in the combat, because you could definitely see some players' minds just drifting off when the combat started because we fell very quick in the trap that we really treated like a board game. Roll dice, see how much damage you do, which I guess is fine occasionally. But especially the way I cut the dungeon short, it was really pretty much fight after fight after fight. First they fought the animated armor, then they fought the living broom, then it was the specter, then it was the ghouls and the Daddy Durst, and finally the mother. And I just felt it was too many combat encounters right after another. So I think for the future I will try to either space them out or try to make them more interesting with more options for the players. Anyway, I cannot wait for the next session, for which I will also create a video. And the goal for that session is to have the players going to the Vistani camp as well as Village Barovia. See you then.